This is going to be, dramatically transformational for at least the technology department, more so than anything we've seen from a cloud revolution or even a digital revolution. This is big. And so tying benefits and outcomes to the costs becomes, something which I think we're going to have to really try and solve, which people are looking at, but no one's really got it correct.
Will agentic AI allow fintechs to regain enough technological and distribution and capability that they can actually be disruptive again, or will this sink them into oblivion? That was Ned Lowe, CTO and co-founder of Mission Plus, a startup that helps firms with agentic engineering. I spoke with Ned about what that means and the opportunities for banks, insurance, and other licensed financial institutions, how they can rewire themselves in the age of AI, and also the implications this has for fintechs and other startups. Ned Lowe, CTO and co-founder of Mission Plus. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
So I wanted to speak with you because, first of all, agentic AI is super hot wherever you go. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. Your new startup is all about agentic engineering, and I want to talk to you about what that means. But also, we've known each other for quite some time because you have a finance and fintech background, many years at Bank of America. You were the CTO at Sing Life in Singapore, where you still reside. Okay. You've done sort of fintech startups. So obviously my audience is fintech and finance. So, you're bringing that kind of background to a more technical discussion of agentic AI, but I think one that we can fit for a general business audience here.
Absolutely. Looking forward to it.
So my first question is, you have written, I guess another reason why I invited you, because you've written some cool stuff on LinkedIn, and that got my attention. One of them was you make a difference between thinking about AI as a product versus AI that builds a product.
That's right.
What does that mean?
I think this is one of the, I don't want to say it's an epiphany because that's giving it way too much credence, but having the language and having this differentiation between these two different modes of operation really unlocked a whole set of opportunities to think more clearly about things. And I think it's that one of the issues that we have right now with AI in general is people conflating the two. So let me break down what I mean by that. When I say AI is the product, I mean that AI is being executed every single time you use it. So that's something like a chatbot. Every time you use a chatbot, AI is executed. It's something like semantic search. It's intelligent agentic workflow. And the issue with AI is the product, and runtime use of AI is it's non-deterministic. So, it doesn't always behave the same way every time you execute it. There's questions from the risk and compliance guys around how do we monitor this? How do we make sure that it's in compliance? It's totally new to us, and everything is moving so quickly. Foundational models are moving so quickly that you're almost always chasing. Every day you wake up and you're like, whole new set of functionalities come out, new models come out. How do I evaluate that? How do I introduce it to my business? AI builds the product is a build time use of AI, where once the AI has executed, the output is just a standard artifact, standard asset. So that might be generating code, that might be generating an image or marketing material, it might be generating a PowerPoint. But once it's generated that asset, AI is no longer in the loop. And that means that the risk and compliance guys, the same checklist we've ever used, work perfectly well in this. Did it pass a UAT? Did it pass a pen test? Is there an IP violation? They're quite much more comfortable. Secondly, that sense of chasing the models is actually reversed because let's say I generate some code and it works, it passes a pen test, whatever. But then a new model comes out. You can take that new model and say, hey, you generated this code previously when you were more dumb. Now you're smarter. Is there any difference? Would you upgrade that code? Would you do it differently? Is there a vulnerability that you didn't previously find? And so you've got a compounding effect of the models improving as opposed to a chasing effect. And these two modes of operation, AI is the product, I think has been underwhelming. We see a lot of stuff in POC land, pilot land that never really gets to production, but AI builds the product. Ooh, that has gone so much more. Like if you told me 2 years ago that you could generate extremely complicated applications where no one had even necessarily read the code, that would I would not have believed you. If you said you could generate videos that was sufficiently high fidelity that a human couldn't tell if it was AI generated or not, I wouldn't have believed you. And then, just to round this off, there are some problems that can be solved with both, where we say, hey, we've got a business intelligence problem. Let's add an AI on the top to help us generate insights. Yeah, that's cool. And maybe it's the right thing to do. But you do have all of those challenges around non-determinism. But maybe can I generate code that would also look at that same data and give me the insights, but in a deterministic way? That might actually be the better answer. But the only reason we haven't gone for that is we're used to that being a 1 month cycle, and we've got to talk to our dev team, we've got to do this, and it's too slow. But if you can generate that in like 5 minutes, maybe that's actually the right answer.
What are the governance issues around that AI builds the product approach so that you create something that's, if you feed in A plus B, it's going to come out, A plus B on the other end, as opposed to A, D, C, whatever. What are the governance frameworks that companies need to think about? And, is it the same kind of governance or
Yeah.
protections as if they're using AI as the product?
I think it's actually a little bit of a different I'm going to reframe that slightly because the governance is not that much different. Once something has been produced, you can use a lot of our existing methodologies around UAT, around pen testing, around whatever it might be. The better question is how do we increase the probability that what is generated agentically is actually what we wanted, which is slightly different to governance. And this is where I want to introduce this concept of spec-driven development or specification-driven development, which is basically the evolution, in my opinion, of Agile. In fact, I'm going so far as to say Agile is dead, which is a little controversial perhaps. And look, if we can generate code extremely quickly, then the constraint we have is no longer around the dev cycle. The constraint is making sure that we've specified what we want to build up front. And so more of our effort goes into specification writing and verification, and then just letting the code generate very quickly. The reflection I give here is if Agile is a steering wheel that gives us feedback loops that allows us to go from where we are now to where the user wants us to be as efficiently as possible, this is more like a rocket. It just goes. It goes very, very fast. But you've got to point it in the right direction to start with. Otherwise, that rocket's just going to keep missing. So adopting what I call the agent-centric development cycle, ACDC, is the shift in thinking from a traditional Agile into spec-driven agent-first development.
Okay. So for someone like me who thinks AC/DC is a rock band, yeah, what is the way that we're thinking about, you said Agile is dead. So for the
Yeah,
past 10 years plus, digital transformation, design thinking, all this stuff at banks and insurers has been built around this concept of DevOps and agile teams. We've seen a lot of theater, right? Everybody ends up with open workspaces, which everyone hates, but they don't actually, they're not Silicon Valley. So,
right.
um, what what is this going to look like for for licensed financial institutions going forward? You think what will be the ways that digital transformation will become some sort of agentic transformation? Um, what does that mean for the way they organize themselves and the way they rethink, culture, workflow?
Okay, it's a big question, and there's multiple elements to this. Um, I think that there is a target state company that is the equivalent of the AI native, right? We had digital native, we've had cloud native, and we'll have the AI native. Uh, and that company will be dramatically smaller and will have AI first principles and will be using agentic workflows at the heart. The average financial services company is not going to be one of those. Maybe there'll be some challenges in the future, but so let's put that aside and look more at, okay, I'm an existing bank, insurer, whoever. What does this mean to me? Um, if agentic engineering unlocks AC/DC,
Mhm.
then AC/DC unlocks what I'm calling Atom, the agentic target operating model. And Atom is going to have a dramatic impact on at least the engineering and technology departments, and probably things like the marketing department similarly. But let me focus more on the technology department because that's the one that's closer to my home. Um, if I can use agents to generate code, if I can use AC/DC to move quickly, then the size of a team will reduce. My sort of rough rule of thumb is from a sort of 7-person squad to a 3-person pod.
Mm.
And that 3-person pod will be as effective or more than what a 7-person squad previously was. Now, if you have a dramatically smaller set of pods, your entire middle management layer reduces because there's less human management required because we're smaller. And I think we underestimate just how much time is spent coordinating people. And there's a very famous sort of diagram from the mythical man month that for every person you add to an organization, the number of new communication channels isn't just +1 because it's all of the other ones.
Right.
So it's actually a power law, not an addition. And taking a team from 10 people down to 5 people or 7 people down to 3 people is dramatically fewer communication channels and all of the complexity that comes with that. And so I see middle management becoming way, way smaller, people having to be much closer to the detail, the pods moving more quickly, probably more co-location with business users, because part of the reason we had to do, nearshoring, offshoring, is because if you had a large team and it was expensive, then the value of moving that offshore was more clear. If it's a dramatically smaller team, then maybe it makes sense to co-locate them. And yes, you pay more per person, but it's worth it on aggregate. Hiring and firing is dramatically different. If I'm using agents to generate code, then the fact that a particular person is a Java expert versus a Python expert is almost irrelevant, because it's what's more important is how you manage the agent or the agentic workflow. And so specifics of languages drop away. Now, there's edge cases to that. If you're a high frequency trading firm, okay, fine, that's a totally different use case. That's a very specialized domain. But most firms are not in that place. And so you get much more fungibility between teams because the specifics of the language is less important than the managing the workflow, which is quite unprecedented, I think, for us. Having people who understand sort of systems thinking, can work with our business users, who can work with the product owners more clearly, again, becomes the preeminent skill, rather than I'm, shit hot at a particular, debugging stack traces. And so I think we're going to see smaller teams, co-located, way more emphasis on architecture, systems thinking, and communication. And look, this is going to be across all companies simultaneously. This is going to be, dramatically transformational for at least the technology department, more so than anything we've seen from a cloud revolution or even a digital revolution. This is big.
Are there lessons we can learn from the trading floors? So you mentioned high frequency trading is a very an outlier, but since well, like let's say 20 plus years, the Wall Street trading firms have completely gone electronic, first with equities and then with bonds and currencies. Um,
Yeah.
a trading desk used to be full of high touch sales traders and people like that and analysts, and now it's you'll have maybe one of that type of person plus a quant specialist and then the person who's like the robot whisperer. So is that a lesson that the rest of the organizations can probably pull from, or am I mixing up apples and oranges because that was a different layer of technology and a different time?
There's almost certainly some parallels around the shifts. Um, I'd say that was a shift. It's almost the opposite in some ways. It almost the opposite, and maybe that's instructional in its own way, which is the shift from being a larger group of people who were, maybe a little more. It was a slower environment from a technical perspective, but maybe a more intense environment from a sales perspective and high touch, reaching out to the client. And that as teams shrank and you got DMA trading, DSA trading, where everything was just coming in electronically and no salesperson was necessarily involved at all. And then the rise of the quants and the rise of the robot whisperer. In some ways, I'd say this is almost the opposite, which is that the agents become the quants and the robot whisperers, and I'm stretching the metaphor maybe a little bit, uh, but the skill then goes back into, well, if everybody is the same, right? If you have access to exactly the same models that I have access, AI models that I have access to, then why would a client go to one person versus the other? Because the underlying capability becomes so commoditized. And obviously trading, there's maybe a little bit of nuance there, but in the majority of cases, if a really amicable, friendly, communicative, empathetic person can drive a model versus a real geeky, hardcore, can't talk to anybody person driving the model, but the model produces the same outcomes, well, who are you going to go and talk to, right? You're going to talk to the nice guy. And so, if anything, I see it as a bit of a reverse. One direct parallel I do see, and where I think we can draw some lessons, is the rollout of cloud and how disruptive that was to certain parts of the infrastructure teams, and how cloud has been a viable option for banks and insurers 15 years now, and yet still many of them have not made much progress on that. And so a lot of the lessons learned of why that was so hard can be translated across into this. And I think there's other lessons that can be learned from the data revolution and how data was always a subordinate part of technology and then got kind of moved out. And now the data team often is a business line team because there's so much potential unlock there. Is that at the moment AI is still in many organizations sitting as part of tech. And I see that changing. I see it being unlocked and moved into more of a business facing function.
What you mentioned cloud. So cloud had and still has massive promise. It provides that scalability. You can turn it on, dial it on or off as you need to, and
Right.
all the benefits of being able to basically outsource compute and calculation, and storage. But at the same time, the costs in cloud have become a real problem for people.
Correct.
And and there's multiple reasons for that. I'm not the expert. I think oligopoly is probably one of them. But how my question is about cloud per se, but it's more as we go into agentic engineering, as we, if people adopt something like your AC/DC methodology, uh, what is the risk that we create new technical debt, that we create new um, costs that may look acceptable today, but as we scale or as we build so rapidly that we end up also building in costs that we don't foresee right now.
Yeah, it's a great point, fantastic point, and let me give a few different reflections on that. The first is going back to my AI is the product versus AI builds the product. I think AI is the product where you get tied into a particular provider or a particular workflow or a particular chatbot or whatever it is. You're definitely at risk of vendor lock-in there. Now, that can be, I say risk there, it's not necessarily a problem, but one has to make those choices very clearly. AI builds the product, less so, because once you've generated the code or you've generated the marketing assets or whatever it is you've generated, if the next time you generate that same piece of code or enhance that code, you use a totally different model, then actually, the code doesn't know the difference, right? It's a static asset. And I think this is where some of the foundational labs have realized that their moat is actually very low. Hence Anthropic, for example, who make Claude, they've massively increased their sort of product offering surface area to try and start capturing other parts of value which are a bit more sticky, because if it's just the model itself, you can swing it across with almost no penalty. And so the value is being captured in a different place than the fundamental model. But where I think you're kind of pointing towards, and an insight that I really want to unlock here is, at the moment, the models themselves are quite subsidized, and that's a reflection of the fact that there's so much competition in the space. But it's also quite hard to tell who's using what when, particularly in a subsidized environment, because if you're paying just like $50 a month, you don't really care if that's been used well or poorly. It's a relatively fixed cost. So I think that particularly for the larger institutions, which have potentially tens of thousands of people using the models, the visualization and the telemetry to understand who is using what where becomes super important. If I use $5,000 a month of AI, but I'm generating $20,000 of value,
okay,
use $6,000, right? Use as much as you want, mate. But if I'm using $1,000 a month, but I'm using it to generate, absolute slop that no one ever uses, then it's just absolute waste. And so tying benefits and outcomes to the costs becomes, something which I think we're going to have to really try and solve, which people are looking at, but no one's really got it correct. And then related to that is the models are moving so quickly. And if I use the best possible model, Opus 4.7, that's the most expensive model, but maybe that's appropriate for what I'm using. And using DeepSeek V4, which is 1% of the cost, is not correct. But at some point, these models are all going to pass some kind of threshold where it's like, if all you're doing is building some dashboard, why on earth are you using the model that could be solving,
right.
maths Olympiad problems, right, cancer research, like you're generating a dashboard, just use the cheapest possible model. And so as well as just tying outcomes to cost, it's also going to be outcomes to cost to, the efficiency of how you've got to those outcomes, because maybe you could have done it much cheaper. And this is going to become an entire field, like cloud ops and FinOps became a thing. I think the AI ops and AI FinOps is going to be like a whole domain.
All right, last two questions. They're kind of related. They're flip sides. And I want to look forward here, and my question is going to assume that we reach some level of comfort around security and reliability.
Okay.
First is because that's a whole other discussion. First is, if I'm a legacy institution operating on legacy mainframes, COBOL language, etc., does AI today represent either the solution to modernizing everything without having to rely on a bunch of 70-year-old programmers who are the only ones who remember how to write this stuff, and I could just boom like that, leapfrog? Or is this the final nail in my coffin? I've left this way too late, and now I'm toast. What do you think is more realistic?
1 billion% the former. And I see this as being a renaissance. And in some ways, as a startup whose whole, raison d'etre is to be more nimble and faster than a legacy player, I would be concerned because the ability for those that get it right, for the banks and insurers to kind of throw off the shackles of the past and begin to modernize in a way that was not possible previously is absolutely available now. And COBOL gets a bad rep. I actually People always talk about the COBOL example and the mainframe example. Mainframes are actually relatively cheap, they're super stable. I actually don't think that COBOL and mainframe is the primary target, although it will become eventually a target. There is way more junk, Java 8 code, which has been sitting there for 15 years,
Middleware.
ancient .NET code, ancient Delphi code, Power Builder, all of this stuff which is lurking in all of the corners of the banks. And no one knows how any of it works. None of it's documented. There's no unit test for anything. And the ability to point an agent at it and say, generate me some tests, so at least future changes, I've got a bit more comfort that they're not introducing regression issues. Generate the documentation and the specifications from the code, which, for a human to go through all of the code and generate the documentation is a gargantuan task, which is why we don't really do it. But the code is a perfect specification because it does what the project, it does what, if it's in production and it works, it is perfectly specified. It's just too hard for us to do as humans. But for an agent to go through the code and turn that into a documentation or specification is absolutely straightforward. So suddenly we can unlock all of the mysteries that have been hiding inside our ancient systems. So I see this as being, yeah, if I was a bank or insurer right now, I would be looking at setting up agentic harnesses around all of my legacy apps.
Yeah. The flip side of that question is in fintech, we've seen time after time where there's a lot of fancy talk about disruption, but all these almost I'd say 99 out of 100 times it becomes either the fintech slots into a bank or insurer or an asset manager because
Right,
they need the distribution or they need to piggyback off a license, or they try to get a
right,
license themselves and basically just become and they grew up and I think in your experience of Single Life we saw some of that evolution into a kind of a much more mainstream kind of company. um,
right.
so my question is, will agentic AI allow fintechs to regain enough technological and distribution and capability that they can actually be disruptive again, or will this sink them into oblivion?
Honestly, and it sounds a little negative and dystopian, but I think more the latter, more sink into oblivion. Um, the as it becomes easier to build product, distribution and eyeballs become ever more valuable. Like let's just take it outside of fintech. Let's talk about just products in general. It's the same real thing. It is absolutely possible right now for me to take a niche domain in a an emerging market and say, okay, I'm absolutely going to own um, Burmese call centers, right? That's my space. I own that space. And for the bigger players, it's just too expensive or not worth attacking it because the returns compared to putting that same effort into one of the core markets is just not worth it. And so, when people have been saying, "Oh, this is now giving the rise of the indie developer," like sure, but actually the rise of the indie developer was, in my opinion, previously. Now the question is, if I'm a giant player and I can suck every little bit of liquidity out of every niche market because, sure, previously those Burmese call centers weren't worth it, but now why not set an agent off it? One person and an agent can now disrupt that market. But I've got the brand presence, I've got the trust, I've got the marketing dollars, so I can just overwhelm it. Um, I actually see this as becoming a concentration of power as opposed to a democratization.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, we're coming toward the end of our time here. I don't want to abuse my 30-minute interview style, but there's so many things that we could have got into. Obviously, mythos and what that means for as banks look at all their old programming. I'm sure they're not the only ones who will be able to look at that old programming and find some interesting things.
Right. Right.
Um, and then, of course, all the issues around reliability of LLM and the fact that you put it in your input, but every time it comes out something different because of the way they operate, and many other issues
Yep.
around security and reliability. But I think lots of people talk about that stuff. I wanted to talk to you about some of the opportunities and some of the cultural shifts that are happening. I think we did that. So this last thing, Ned, is just how can people find you and what do they need Mission Plus for?
Great question. So you can find us at mission.plus, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm quite I write quite a lot about agentic engineering. What would you come to us for? If you have any questions or any problems in the agentic engineering or AI space, if you're going through a transformation, you're wondering how to get the best practices of how to bring AI or agentic engineering into your organization, we can help advise and consult on that. We can do embedded development and have people do coaching and mentorship from the inside, or we can just take some of those problems off your hands and we'll build it for you. So yeah, we can do everything when it comes to agentic engineering. That's us.
All right. Well, hell's bells. Back to back. All right, we're gonna rock it. We're gonna rock this. Okay.
Absolutely.
Ned Lowe, thanks a lot for joining me on the program today.
Thanks for having me.